Following the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88, an ancient prophecy by Bishop St. Malachy has resurfaced. A chilling prediction that the end of the papal line and even the arrival of Judgment Day could be near. Before his passing, Pope Francis not only left behind his final words for the world, but also made a surprising decision regarding his burial place. Now, as signs seem to align with St. Malachy's prophecy, the world turns its eyes toward the next successor, or perhaps wonders if the era of the papacy itself is about to end. We were not made for death, but for life. At 9:45 a.m., April 21, 2025, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church, announced the death of Pope Francis from the Casa Santa Marta with these words: "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of His Church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and most marginalized. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and triune God." Just 20 hours before his passing, Pope Francis shared a deeply meaningful message on Easter Day, reminding the world of the essence of life, freedom, and peace. His final tweet read, "Christ is risen. These words capture the entire meaning of our existence, for we were not made for death, but for life." The tweet echoed his Easter message, which he delivered earlier that day in a brief public appearance at St. Peter's Square. Despite being seated in a wheelchair due to ongoing health issues, Pope Francis's presence was a source of strength and inspiration to the faithful. The 88-year-old pontiff's words resonated with profound significance as he addressed the need for peace and freedom, both of which he emphasized in his address. Pope Francis, in his Easter address, declared the resurrection of Christ as the cornerstone of human hope. "Christ is risen," he proclaimed, reminding the world that this powerful event signified the triumph of love over hatred, light over darkness, and life over death. He reaffirmed that humanity was not made for death, but for life, a sentiment that he shared in his final tweet. As he urged the world to embrace the message of Easter, Pope Francis called for a renewed sense of trust, not only in God, but also in one another. He emphasized the importance of respecting freedom of religion, freedom of thought, and freedom of expression, which he believed were essential to achieving lasting peace. His call for peace was directed toward global conflicts. The Pope also made a heartfelt appeal to world leaders, urging them to reject fear-driven policies and instead focus on solidarity, humanitarian efforts, and development. His message emphasized that true peace could only be achieved when people valued and protected the dignity of every individual. In his address, Pope Francis extended his compassion to the marginalized, the vulnerable, and those experiencing suffering. He highlighted the plight of the elderly, the sick, and refugees, stressing that in God's eyes, every life is precious. He also condemned the increasing violence and contempt faced by women and children in many parts of the world, urging society to be more compassionate and inclusive. His final words were a call for hope and renewal. "Let us entrust ourselves to God, for He alone can make all things new." As the world mourns the loss of Pope Francis, his final message, both in his tweet and in his public appearance, will be remembered as a testament to his unwavering commitment to faith, peace, and human dignity. The message, which celebrated the Easter story, saw him remind people that, from the empty tomb in Jerusalem, we hear unexpected good news. Jesus, who was crucified, is not here, He has risen. Jesus is not in the tomb, He is alive. Love has triumphed over hatred, light over darkness, and truth over falsehood. Pope Francis's passing marks the end of an era, but his message of life, freedom, and peace will continue to resonate with millions around the world. His final Easter message reminds humanity that life is a precious gift, and peace is possible when we embrace compassion and respect for one another. His words, shared both on social media and from the heart of the Vatican, will serve as an enduring legacy for generations to come. The fulfilled prophecy. Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, died after suffering complications with double pneumonia and a respiratory tract infection, per the Vatican. He was elected in March of 2013, making him the 266th Pope, the first Jesuit Pope, and the first Pope from Latin America. His papacy was characterized by humility, transparency, and reform. The death of Pope Francis has reignited global curiosity in a 900-year-old prophecy that suggests he may be the last pontiff before Judgment Day. The prophecy, attributed to Saint Malachy, a 12th-century Irish archbishop, claims that the world will face divine judgment in 2027, ending both the papal line and the Holy Roman Church. The prophecy of the popes was discovered in 1590 by Benedictine monk Arnold Wyon and is kept in the Vatican's secret archives. This work describes 112 cryptic mottos in Latin, each relating to succeeding popes, starting with Celestine II. The book says that Pope Francis would be the last pope before Peter the Roman comes to lead the Church through the trials and tribulations before the destruction of Rome and the final judgment. The final statement in the passage states, "In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will reign Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep and will be greatly persecuted, after which the seven-hilled city will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge the people." The end. Some interpret the seven-hilled city as Rome, and see the rise of a figure like Peter the Roman, following Francis's passing as a fulfillment of prophecy. Moreover, a cryptic link is drawn from Pope Sixtus V's passage in the prophecy, suggesting that 442 years from his papacy, the world would end, precisely in 2027. Furthermore, biblical scripture itself cautions against such predictions. Matthew 24:36 states, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." A decision no one expected. It wasn't with words, but with actions. Pope Francis wanted to break with tradition even after his death. He did so with a historic decision about his own burial. Pope Francis will not be buried in the traditional Vatican grottos. Instead, his body will rest in the Roman Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore, a Marian site for which he felt special devotion. It is an unprecedented gesture that hasn't occurred in over a century. With this choice, he breaks a deeply rooted custom within the Church. Since Pope Leo XIII, no pontiff had opted for a place other than the Vatican for their burial. Consistent with his approachable and reformist style, Francis has decided to make a difference once again. Pope Francis's choice is not random. As he explained in Life, he promised the Virgin Mary to rest there. His devotion to the Salus Populi Romani icon, kept in the basilica, has guided his will. It is not merely a symbolic gesture. The Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore hasn't hosted the remains of a pope since 1669, when Clement IX was buried there. More than 3 centuries have passed since then, making this decision a historic event. This final choice perfectly reflects the character of his pontificate. Francis has distinguished himself as a humble spiritual leader, close to the people and determined to reform many traditions. His farewell, as expected, could not stray from that line. Archbishop Diego Ravelli confirmed that the funeral will also have a different character than usual. The traditional title of Romanus Pontifex will not be used during the celebrations. Additionally, solemn elements like the triple coffin or the classic catafalque will be omitted. Instead, a simple wooden coffin without excessive ornaments has been chosen. The body will be dressed in the usual liturgical vestments, but the entire rite will avoid any display of ostentation. As Ravelli explained, it will be the burial of a shepherd and disciple of Christ, not that of an earthly ruler. During the 9 days of mourning, daily masses will be held. The body will be moved to the chapel of St. Martha for the faithful to pay their respects. Access will be open to all. The funeral, although more austere, will be of great magnitude. The presence of religious leaders, heads of state, and thousands of people is expected. It will be a massive farewell, but intimate in essence. Pope Francis left all his instructions detailed in writing. His desire was to have a different ceremony, simpler and deeply human. He wanted to avoid the solemn protocols that, in his opinion, could create distance from the people. The cycle of his pontificate will close with 3 phases. The first will be in his residence, with the body placed in the coffin. The second, with the farewell of the faithful in the basilica. The third phase will culminate with the burial. However, this time, it will not be in the Vatican, but in a chapel dedicated to the Virgin, whom he so revered. There is no doubt that Pope Francis's figure leaves an indelible mark, not only for what he did in life, but also for how he wanted to be remembered. The Papal Conclave. The process by which a new pope is elected has undergone numerous changes in the nearly 2 millennia that the Catholic Church has existed, with the current procedure a combination of ancient traditions and modern updates as recent as 2013, reflecting changes instituted by Pope Benedict XVI. Even so, the essential ritual has remained largely unchanged for centuries. Pope Francis's death sets into motion a series of formalized rites and observances that occur during what is called the interregnum, which begins upon the pontiff's passing and ends with the election of his successor. The period of time during which the papacy is vacant is known as the sede vacante, Latin for vacant seat. The next pope will be chosen by the College of Cardinals, the Catholic Church's most senior figures appointed by the pontiff, who will make their way to Rome in the next few days for the conclave. The name comes from the Latin cum clave, meaning with key, indicating the closed process of electing a pope. The pope's death is first ritually verified by the Cardinal Camerlengo, or Chamberlain, who runs the ordinary affairs of the Vatican city-state during the sede vacante. A traditional 9 days of mourning then commences. This includes the pope's funeral, which per tradition is held within 4 to 6 days of his death, after his body lies in state for several days in St. Peter's Basilica. This also allows global dignitaries and heads of state to pay their respects and attend the funeral. There are more than 220 cardinals from more than 70 countries, but only about 120 are cardinal electors. Those over the age of 80 are excluded. 2/3 of the cardinal electors have been chosen by Francis in the past 10 years and largely reflect his vision of a more inclusive church. Once the cardinals are assembled in Rome, usually 15 to 20 days after the Pope's death, they gather under Michelangelo's magnificent painted ceiling in the Sistine Chapel to begin their deliberations. After the words extra omnes, everyone out, are declared, referring to all but voting cardinals and a handful of officials and doctors, the doors are locked. The cardinals swear an oath of absolute secrecy and are permitted no contact with the outside world for the duration of the election process. Their phones are removed, and no newspapers, television, letters, or messages are allowed. The chapel is also swept for listening devices before and during the conclave. The cardinals sleep and eat in a purpose-built hostel, St. Martha's House, near the Sistine Chapel, where Pope Francis has lived for the past 12 years. The conclave begins with a celebration of Mass, after which deliberations and voting begins. Votes are taken each day, morning and afternoon, until a candidate wins a 2/3 majority. There is a day's break for prayer and reflection after every 7 ballots. If there is no conclusive result after 30 ballots, a candidate will be elected on a simple majority. The longest papal conclave in recent history was 1922, when the cardinals took 5 days to choose their new leader. Any baptized male can be elected as pope, although a serving cardinal is invariably chosen. Each elector is given a ballot card with the words eligo in summum pontificem, I elect as Supreme Pontiff, printed at the top. They insert the name of their choice, fold the card, and drop it into a chalice. The ballot is secret, but that does not mean the process is immune from factionalizing, intrigue, and lobbying. The College of Cardinals will cast as many as 4 ballots in a single day for the next pope, with a 2/3 majority required to elect a pontiff. After each vote, the ballots are burned and smoke is released from the Sistine Chapel's chimney as a signal to the throngs holding vigil in St. Peter's Square. Black smoke, fumata nera in Italian, indicates an inconclusive vote, while white smoke, fumata bianca, will signify that a new pope has been elected. If 3 days pass with no pope elected, voting can be suspended for a day to allow the cardinals time for reflection before the next round of ballots are cast. Once the College of Cardinals elects a new pope, the candidate is formally asked in the Sistine Chapel if he accepts the election and, if so, to choose his papal name. While popes have the option of keeping their baptismal name, every pope for the last 470 years has chosen to change his name, usually to honor a predecessor and to signal their intention to emulate his example. The successful candidate is asked if he accepts election and, if so, which name he chooses to take as pontiff. The cardinals pledge obedience to the new pope, who is led into the adjacent room of tears to be dressed in a white cassock and skullcap and red slippers. 3 sets of vestments in different sizes will have been made by Vatican tailors in advance. The Dean of the Cardinals steps on to the main balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, in front of which thousands of Catholic devotees and tourists will be gathered. The Dean will declare, Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam, which means, I announce to you with great joy, we have a pope. The Pope of Peace and for Peace. In the memory of Pope Francis, we all remember him as a Pope of Peace through his tireless appeals and constant visits to show his closeness to those suffering the consequences of one of the most unjust human-made disasters, war. At his last public appearance, Pope Francis repeated what had become a slogan in his pontificate of peace. Everyone knew to expect it at the end of his audiences, but never did it lose its strength. During the Easter Urbi et Orbi blessing, the day before he died, the Pope's words echoed the countless appeals he had made over the years, urging world leaders to lay down arms and turn to dialogue. Even as he struggled to speak, having asked someone to read his message on his behalf, his voice, albeit weak, resonated across St. Peter's Square and screens across the world. From the first days of his 12-year-long pontificate, Pope Francis spearheaded the global Catholic movement for peace advocacy. Through words, actions, and deeds, he demonstrated his unshakable belief in the power of reconciliation, the importance of dialogue, and the urgency of ending violence in all its forms. Dubbed the Pope of the Peripheries, Pope Francis always took the time to remember those suffering from conflict. While praying for peace in areas that gain most of the media attention, he also never failed to channel his prayers to some of the areas most hard-hit, yet most forgotten by the world. During his life, in a way, with different people's assessments corresponding to different perspectives and scales, Francis may not have accomplished everything he hoped for, but he was a leader whose charisma and desire to connect with people will long be remembered. He's managed to give many people who had little hope in their church renewed hope. Why do we have a pope? Jesus had countless souls who learned from him, but he only had 12 who he worked with quite intimately. They were sent out on a very specific apostolic mission after being trained by Christ himself. Out of those 12, there were 3 that he selected to be in his closest, inner circle of friends, is Peter, James, and John. Each of the 3 was given a special role in the church. Peter was the rock on which Jesus would build his church. As every group needs a leader, someone to cast the deciding vote, so did the apostles and the bishops. Simon Peter, the fisherman, rose to the occasion. In his line are popes who become saints and popes who were less than saintly. Yet every pope was given special authority by God to guide the church for a time. As humans, everyone has sins, including Peter himself and even his successors. So, why would Jesus entrust his church to sinners? It's not like Jesus didn't know that people were going to sin. He knows all. He's God. The church, like Jesus Christ, is both human and divine. So while the church is divinely fueled, guided by the Holy Spirit, and perfect in her teachings, it is still composed of humans who are imperfect. Sin exists in the pews just as much as it does in the sacristies, and even when people in leadership sin, that does not render God's laws or God's truths any less valid or truthful. Christ knew Peter was not perfect, yet he still chose him for an all-important task of guiding the church on earth. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The event that Jesus changes Simon's name to Peter is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Because a change in someone's name signals a change in a person's essence. While rock was used to speak about God and even Abraham in the Old Testament, Peter is the only person to be designated the rock by Christ. To be clear, this designation did not mean that Peter became divine, but let's say that it carries with it a divine assistance, an assistance that Jesus promises us. Jesus tells Peter that he is going to build his church. While that is a pretty straightforward statement, some people believe that the first time Jesus says rock, that he is referring to Peter, and the second time he says it, that he's referring to himself. Jesus promises that the netherworld will not prevail against the church. Okay, so what will evil never prevail against? The church. People point to modern problems within the church or a scandal as some sort of proof that Christ was talking about himself as the church, not a church on earth. Not true. Battles may be lost, but never the war. The church will always prevail. Christ promises us that. Jesus gives Peter the keys. The keys not only let people in, they lock people out. The keys signify power. This action, too, is biblical. As seen in Isaiah 22, the Prime Minister of Israel is given the keys, and with that, the power to govern God's people on earth. What Jesus was doing was not only landmark for the future, but also rooted in the past. Think about what it says in Luke 10:16, "Whoever listens to you listens to me. Whoever rejects you rejects me, and whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me." Jesus gives Peter the power to bind and to loose. What does that mean? Sacramental power through confession and reconciliation. Ask yourself, how would Peter, the apostles, or any priest know which sins to bind or to loose if they had not heard the sins first? And Jesus is very clear. They have authority on earth that counts in heaven. Since Peter was martyred, we have been blessed with an unbroken apostolic succession. That is why we have had a successor to the chair of Peter ever since his crucifixion in the mid-1st century. Some claim that the church at times had multiple popes. That is not true. At certain times, there have been more than one person claiming to be the pontiff. However, there has only been one true pope at a time. Does God pick the pope? With every pope is chosen, people began announcing him as God's choice, and speaking as if, in every conclave, the Holy Spirit himself selects the pope. It's customary for people to speak that way in the jubilation that occurs whenever a new pope is elected. That kind of language is understandable as a way of building confidence for the new pontificate. But is it literally true? Does the Holy Spirit really select the best man? The cardinals in a conclave certainly invoke the Holy Spirit and seek his guidance, but he does not override their free will. So in what sense can the election of a pope be said to be God's will? Everything that happens in history takes place under God's providential care. By his omnipotence, God could stop any event from occurring. And so, if something happens, it's because God allows it. The election of a pope thus can be said to be God's will in the same sense that any historical event can be. In this broad sense, however, the fact that something is God's will does not guarantee that He approves of it. It may be God's will to allow a man to commit adultery, but that doesn't mean He approves of the act. Is the election of a pope in accord with God's will only in this minimal sense, or does it involve something greater? Although God does not override human free will, He does offer guidance. Jesus gave the church certain promises in this regard, stating, "When the Spirit of truth comes, He will guide you into all the truth." God has thus promised to give the church His guidance. He has also promised it to individuals. "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men generously and without reproaching, and it will be given him." If an individual man seeks God's guidance, he can count on it being given. This does not mean it will be easy to hear or understand, or that the man will act on it, but it does mean that God will offer His assistance in some way. Similarly, when the College of Cardinals seeks God's guidance in a conclave, they can be confident He will give it. Indeed, given the weightiness of the decision facing the cardinals and the implications it will have for the entire church, they can expect He will provide even greater guidance. This does not guarantee that the guidance will be easy to hear or understand, or that the cardinals will act on it, but it does mean that God's assistance will be provided. By presuming the discernment and goodwill of the cardinals, we may presume that the man they elect was chosen in accord with God's guidance, and thus that his election was God's will in a greater way than if God merely allowed it. We should be careful about assuming that there is only one correct choice for pope, for the process of selecting a pope is similar to the process of selecting a spouse. Pop culture sometimes promotes the idea that all people have a soulmate, a single best individual that they should marry, but the reality is more complex. Each marriage prospect has different strengths and weaknesses, and depending on whom you choose, your marriage will unfold in different ways. But that doesn't mean there is one best candidate you must find. Even if there were, identifying that person with confidence cannot be humanly accomplished, given the number of factors and the number of unknowns in play. Similarly, candidates for the papacy have different strengths and weaknesses. Depending on whom the cardinals choose, the next papacy will unfold in different ways. But there may not be a single best choice, or one that is humanly knowable. Once a selection has been made, however, a new mode of divine will comes into play. In the case of a marriage, once you exchange vows, it is God's will that you treat that person as your spouse. The realm of possibilities that existed before has now reduced to a single person, and that person is your divinely ordained spouse. God ordained that you be spouses in the moment the vows were exchanged, and what God has joined together, let man not separate. It's now your job to make the marriage work, not to worry about what ifs and might have been. Similarly, when a man accepts his election as pope, he becomes the divinely ordained pope, and it's now everyone's job in the church to support him in the various ways that are appropriate to their station to make the papacy work. Spouses are not perfect, and neither are popes. Just as every marriage has challenges and requires work, so does every papacy. Nobody knows when the next conclave will be, but we can draw several implications from all this. First, we can be confident from the fact that the cardinals seek God's guidance that He will give it to them, as He has promised. Second, even if they make a suboptimal choice, we can be confident that God will ultimately bring good out of it. For in everything God works for good with those who love Him. Third, we need to pray. We need to pray now that good cardinals will be chosen, and when they meet in conclave, we need to pray that they will earnestly seek and heed God's guidance. Silence has fallen over the Vatican. The Catholic Church has lost its highest spiritual leader, Pope Francis, who has passed away at the age of 88. Pope Francis was not just a point of reference for Catholics, but for all of humanity, thanks to his compassion. What struck the world is that the Pope waited to say his final goodbye on Easter Sunday, such a meaningful day for Catholics. It's as if he wanted to hold on just long enough to say goodbye to all of us. During his public appearance at the Easter Mass, struggling to breathe, he gave final instructions to his flock. No one knew at the time that these would be a father's last words to his children. Looking back, everything he said was a warning to the world. The very last words. The death of Pope Francis has been announced by the Camerlengo, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell, through a video released from the Vatican. The pontiff passed away on April 21, 2025, at 7:35 a.m. in his residence at the Casa Santa Marta, where he was convalescing. During the last month, his health condition worsened due to bronchitis caused by an infection, which was compounded by severe bilateral pneumonia. The entire world holds its breath at the end of a pontificate marked by closeness, reform, and commitment to the most disadvantaged. Despite his delicate health, Pope Francis wanted to keep his appointment with the faithful. In a wheelchair and without oxygen, he appeared on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica on Easter Day 2025. From there, he gave his last Urbi et Orbi blessing. He asked Master of Pontifical Liturgical Celebrations, Diego Ravelli, to read the Easter message. Then he wished everyone present a happy Easter. The gesture was applauded by the nearly 50,000 faithful gathered in the square. The pontiff was visibly weakened. He spoke with difficulty, from his wheelchair, without oxygen cannulas. Even so, he delivered a brief message. Brothers and sisters, Happy Easter. During the Easter Sunday celebration, he delegated the main reading. In his message, he called for peace in the world's conflicts. He also lamented the disdain toward migrants and expressed opposition to rearmament. After the blessing, Pope Francis wanted to tour St. Peter's Square in the Pope-mobile, greeting the faithful who acclaimed him. He stopped several times to bless some children, showing closeness despite his fragile state. Today, that simple and brave gesture is remembered as his last farewell to the people. Despite his fragile state, he wanted to be present at the Easter celebration. His gesture has been interpreted as an act of faith and final dedication. Pope Francis, not long after, died within a few hours. The Camerlengo Cardinal declared, "Dear brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the passing of our Holy Father Francis." It was the message that confirmed the news to the world. Pope Francis also left a final message on his social media. On his official X account, he wrote, "Christ is risen. In this announcement is contained the entire meaning of our existence, which is not made for death, but for life." These words now take on an even deeper meaning. Written just a few hours before he died, his message about life triumphing over death becomes a final testimony of faith. It was his way of saying goodbye, reaffirming that his existence, as he himself expressed, was not destined to die, but to transcend. Pope Francis has left an indelible mark on the Church and millions of faithful. His final message, centered on life beyond death, sums up his faith and his legacy. In 2025, the Catholic world bids him farewell with sorrow but also with hope. The succession process. All eyes turn to the conclave after Pope Francis's death. In the coming days, the Dean Cardinal, Giovanni Battista Re, will convene the cardinals. Only those under 80 years old, considered electors, must travel to Rome. Their mission will be to participate in the conclave and elect the next pontiff. The Vatican has reacted quickly to the Pope's passing. On April 23rd, the College of Cardinals was convened. The exequies will be held and the general congregations will begin. This has been confirmed by the president of the Spanish Episcopal Conference, Luis Arguello, who has detailed that the general congregations will begin on April 23rd. These meetings will serve to prepare the way for the next conclave, in which the cardinals will elect Francis's successor. From that process, the new Bishop of Rome will emerge, who must continue the Church's mission in the current world. The conclave must begin between 15 and 20 days after Pope Francis's death. The cardinals will meet in the Sistine Chapel after a special mass. Voting will take place up to 4 times a day. To have a new pope, a 2/3 majority is needed. By the time there is consensus, white smoke will emerge from the Vatican. Then the world will hear the traditional Habemus Papam from the balcony of St. Peter's. Arguello has asked the faithful to pray for the Pope's soul and to give thanks for his dedication and service to the Church. He has also called for invoking the presence of the Holy Spirit to illuminate the election of the next pontiff. His words have been filled with respect and admiration for the one who was, for more than a decade, the universal pastor of Catholics. The death of Pope Francis not only marks the end of an era, but also opens a time of reflection and transition for the Church. With eyes on the Vatican, the entire world now awaits the beginning of a new chapter under the leadership of the future Pope. The Pope of Peace and for Peace. We remember Pope Francis as a Pope of peace through his tireless appeals and constant visits to show his closeness to those suffering the consequences of one of the most unjust human-made disasters, war. At his last public appearance, Pope Francis repeated what had become a slogan in his pontificate of peace. Everyone knew to expect it at the end of his audiences, but never did it lose its strength. During the Easter Urbi et Orbi blessing, the day before he died, the Pope's words echoed the countless appeals he had made over the years, urging world leaders to lay down arms and turn to dialogue. Even as he struggled to speak, having asked someone to read his message on his behalf, his voice, albeit weak, resonated across St. Peter's Square and screens across the world. From the first days of his 12-year-long pontificate, Pope Francis spearheaded the global Catholic movement for peace advocacy. Through words, actions, and deeds, he demonstrated his unshakable belief in the power of reconciliation, the importance of dialogue, and the urgency of ending violence in all its forms. Dubbed the Pope of the Peripheries, Pope Francis always took the time to remember those suffering from conflict. While praying for peace in areas that gain most of the media attention, he also never failed to channel his prayers to some of the areas most hard-hit, yet most forgotten by the world. One of his most symbolic gestures, and a particularly striking moment of his pontificate, was in April 2019, when he knelt to kiss the feet of South Sudanese leaders at the head of a country grappling with a horrific civil war. As he greeted President Salva Kiir and his rival Riek Machar in the Vatican, the Pope, in his humility, kissed their feet, urging the leaders to lay down their weapons and pursue paths of peace. His personal plea turned diplomatic when, 4 years later, in February 2023, he traveled to South Sudan. Along with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Church of Scotland, he warmly addressed thousands of faithful who had suffered and continued to endure the brutal consequences of war. Then, as he addressed the nation's authorities, civil society and diplomatic corps at the presidential palace in Juba, he warned them, "Future generations will either venerate your names or cancel their memory, based on what you now do." His cry for peace also looked to the legacy of wars past, the scars inflicted by the violent atrocities committed between nations and peoples, and ensuring that certain mistakes are never repeated. During his visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in November 2019, Pope Francis delivered a powerful plea against nuclear weapons. Standing at the atomic bomb hypocenter park in Nagasaki, on the same ground where atomic bombs had caused unprecedented destruction, he condemned the devastation caused by such arms and all who possess them, declaring, "The use of atomic energy for purposes of war is immoral, just as the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral." Pope Francis consistently sought to address the roots of destruction, urging those in positions of power to take responsibility. His advocacy for denuclearization was essential in this. So often, Pope Francis denounced the arms trade, repeatedly condemning those who profit from war. Addressing the United States Congress on September 24, 2015, he posed a haunting question. Why are deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood. He described the investment of money in weapons as madness and decried the debt linked to the black market of arms. As the world entered 2025, his message remained as urgent as ever. Stop colonizing people with weapons. Just as South Sudan was, many more of Pope Francis's apostolic journeys were dedicated to peace. In March 2021, he made history as the first pope to travel to Iraq. There, he brought a message of unity and hope to a nation devastated by years of conflict. In particular, his meeting with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani in Najaf underscored the power of interreligious dialogue and mutual respect, and led to Pope Francis's statement that peace does not demand winners or losers, but brothers and sisters who, despite misunderstandings and past wounds, choose the path of dialogue. Most recently, in September 2024, Pope Francis visited East Timor, a young nation that fought long and hard for independence. His presence was a fierce sign of closeness to the most Catholic nation in the world, which struggled so long for freedom and is still healing from its past. There, as he celebrated Mass at Tasitolu for 600,000 people, the Pope reminded those present that you remained firm in hope even amid affliction, and, thanks to the character of your people and your faith, you have turned sorrow into joy. Beyond his travels, Pope Francis has used his voice to intervene in global conflicts, appealing tirelessly for ceasefires and negotiations. In May 2014, Israeli President Shimon Peres and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas met with him in the Vatican for a prayer summit, demonstrating his belief that prayer and dialogue could pave the way for peace. Since then, as violence continued to escalate in the Middle East, in October 2024, Pope Francis made an impassioned plea for a ceasefire in Gaza, the release of Israeli hostages, and humanitarian access to those in need across the region. In that same month, after 1 year of the Israeli offensive in Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and former Palestinian Minister for Foreign Affairs Nasser al-Kidwa presented Pope Francis with their peace proposal for the war devastating their nations. The Pope's closeness to those who suffer and his advocacy for an end to global violence were always a priority. Even in moments of personal difficulty, Pope Francis remained committed to peace. In his final weeks, throughout his hospitalization for bilateral pneumonia, Pope Francis took the time to video chat with the Holy Family Parish in Gaza, with whom he has been in close contact throughout the entirety of the Israeli offensive. In this holy year dedicated to hope, Pope Francis's messages, closeness, and care for peace are a legacy that will continue to resonate throughout the future of the Church and humanity. Remembering that his was not just a cry for an absence of war, but for the presence of justice, dialogue, and fraternity, for a world that is for everyone and not just for some, and in which those who have more never, ever forget those who have less. The low-cost funeral. The death of Pope Francis was unexpected. Although his health was delicate and concerning, almost no one imagined that the worst could happen so soon. Now, the focus is on his farewell and the next steps the Holy See will take to appoint his successor. Even so, Francis had already left instructions on how his funeral should be. Talking about one's own death is not easy. However, Pope Francis left everything prepared. He wanted a simpler funeral than previous ones. He considered that many aspects of papal funerals were too ostentatious. That's why he requested to minimize the most ceremonial elements. He wanted a dignified but sober rite, like that of any Christian. In his farewell, There will be no body displayed on the catafalque in St. Peter's Basilica, nor will there be a wake reserved for high ecclesiastical officials. There will be a single wake, open to the public. His wishes were put in writing weeks before. His body will be placed in an open wooden coffin in the Vatican Basilica. The casket will be closed just before the funeral mass. Francis also requested to be buried in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. He had a special attachment to this place. There is the icon of the Salus Populi Romani, to which he had a great devotion. For that reason, he decided not to rest in the Vatican crypt. The papal seat will be vacant once the burial is held. Then, preparations will begin to choose the new pontiff. Then, the cardinals will meet in conclave. When there is a new pope, he will be presented from the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. The death of the pope activates a highly regulated process. Everything follows a series of defined steps. The first procedure is to certify his death. Only the chief of staff can officially announce it with the phrase, "Ver papa mortuus est," that is, the pope is really dead. Additionally, a doctor must confirm the pontiff's death. This was not always the case in the past. Then, the chief of staff has another symbolic task, to close and seal his room and office. This gesture has an ancient origin. It served to prevent theft or tampering. Once these rituals are completed, and the funeral is celebrated according to his wishes, the decisive stage begins, choosing the new pope. A legacy as a Catholic Church reformer. From working as a bouncer at a Buenos Aires nightclub to presiding over the Vatican, the path Pope Francis forged as the leader of the Roman Catholic Church was as unlikely as it was unprecedented. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Francis was the first pontiff from South America, and not just South America, but the Americas overall. The son of Italian immigrant parents, his father, Mario José Bergoglio, was an accountant for the country's railways, and his mother, Regina Maria Sivori, a housewife. He studied chemistry before he entered the seminary, and he was 32 when he was ordained in 1969. 4 years later, Francis became head of the Jesuits in Argentina and was elevated to cardinal by John Paul II in 2001. Soon, Francis's name was on the short list of possible successors to the Polish pontiff, who died in 2005. But Francis was a runner-up that year in the conclave that elected German Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger to become Pope Benedict XVI. His turn came 8 years later, after Benedict's abrupt resignation. Francis took the reins of a church that was tarnished by financial scandals and still reeling the first papal resignation in 700 years. He moved quickly to re-establish order. He often likened the church to a field hospital after battle, where the first things priests need to do for their congregants is stop the bleeding. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars, Francis said. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up. The first Jesuit to occupy the chair of St. Peter, Francis took the name of Saint. Francis of Assisi, a 12th century figure who famously turned his back on family wealth in favor of a monastic life of service to the poor and the environment. Other popes have had the same message, but Francis has been very insistent in keeping this message at the forefront, servant leadership and caring for those most in need first. Francis cut a modest and almost deferential figure in his first hours as Pope on March 13, 2013, when he greeted the crowd gathered below his balcony in St. Peter's Square with a bow. The next morning, Francis returned to the boarding house where he had been staying to collect his belongings and settle the bill. Instead of the traditional papal apartments at the Apostolic Palace, Francis chose to live at the Casa Santa Marta, a simple residence in the Vatican used by official visitors. While Francis had little use for the trappings of the papacy, he understood the need for the pomp of the office. Like John Paul II, Francis was a skilled communicator who knew how to work a crowd. And unlike the more reserved Benedict, Francis was eager to embrace people and not just fellow Catholics. When introduced to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp survivor Lydia Maximovich, he leaned over and kissed the number that the Nazis had tattooed on her arm. Francis spoke out against the idolatry of money and an unfair global economic system that forced millions to live in poverty. He stood up for the mostly Muslim migrants from poor and war-torn countries such as Libya and Syria who were seeking shelter in Europe. In his first official trip outside Rome, he celebrated Mass on the tiny Mediterranean island of Lampedusa to commemorate migrants who drowned while crossing the sea from North Africa. We have become used to other people's suffering. It doesn't concern us. It doesn't interest us. It's none of our business, Francis said during his homily from an altar built from an old fishing boat to symbolize the migrants' perilous crossing. Determined to pastor to the global church, Francis traveled extensively, visiting South America, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the US. In 2021, Francis made the first visit by a pope to Iraq, risking his own security. He later learned of foiled assassination attempts against him, where he urged the country's dwindling number of Christians to stay put and help rebuild the country after years of war. Then, Francis condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, calling it a negation of God's dream. Let the desperate cry of the suffering people be heard, Francis declared. Have respect for human life and stop the macabre destruction of cities and villages in the east of Ukraine. Francis met 3 times with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. In 2015, Francis became only the 3rd pope to visit the White House and the first to address Congress, where he urged lawmakers to tackle climate change, a theme he returned to often over his tenure. When Joe Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement to limit global warming, the Vatican welcomed the move. In 2020, Francis elevated 13 clergymen from around the world to the rank of cardinal. One of them was the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Wilton Gregory, the first African American appointed to the Catholic Church's highest governing body. Gregory's appointment was significant for another reason. He was part of a select group of Catholic leaders who criticized Trump for staging a picture in front of St. John's Episcopal Church near the White House during protests over the police killing of George Floyd. Francis also helped broker a historic thaw between the U.S. and Cuba, before traveling to the communist country in 2015 and meeting with former leader Fidel Castro. In January 2021, Francis changed church law to formally allow women to serve as readers at liturgies and as altar servers, acknowledging in canon law what had already been taking place in many churches around the world and preventing more conservative leaders from blocking women from those roles. Then, in May 2021, Francis launched an initiative to make Catholic institutions environmentally sustainable in 7 years, saying a predatory attitude toward the planet must end. In July of that year, Francis reimposed restrictions on the old-style Latin masses. He said Latin-only masses were being used to divide the Church, even though his 2 predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict, had allowed them. Pope Francis was keen to flex his muscles as supreme pontiff. He angered some Catholic Church traditionalists by reaching out to gay and marginalized people, demanding justice for the poor and the dispossessed, and railing against unbridled capitalism and climate change. As the first pope from the Americas, Francis was in many ways the ultimate Vatican outsider who charted a new and more liberal course as the leader of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics. He embarked on a real reorganization of the Church and a real reorientation of the Church after 4 decades of conservative theologians leading the way, said David Gibson, director of the Fordham Center on Religion and Culture. Case in point, Francis announced a radical change in Vatican policy in December 2023 by formally allowing priests to bless same-sex couples. Still, he continued to oppose gay marriage, to the dismay of more liberal Catholics. Francis also ratcheted up action against the sexual abuse of children by Catholic Church clergy, by issuing the most extensive revision to its law in 4 decades, calling it our shame. And Francis steadfastly championed the plight of migrants at a time when many countries across the globe, including the United States, were closing their borders and right-wing politicians were demonizing them. The first signs that Francis's health was deteriorating appeared when the Pope started using a wheelchair after suffering increased mobility problems. Soon, the Catholic media and other news organizations began speculating on whether he would step down, like Benedict had done before him. Francis fueled those rumors further when he announced plans for a visit in August 2022 to the Italian city of L'Aquila for a feast initiated by Pope Celestine V. That pope also resigned while still in office, albeit more than 700 years before Benedict. With an eye on preserving his legacy, Francis in December 2024 elevated 21 new cardinals, all but one of whom were under the age of 80 and thus eligible to vote in a conclave to elect a new pope. That group included the 44-year-old head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Melbourne, Australia, Mykola Bychok. Meanwhile, Francis was hobbled by bouts of influenza and other related health issues. He underwent surgery in 2021 to address a painful condition called diverticulitis, and in 2023, he had another surgery to repair a hernia. In January 2024, Francis appeared in a sling after injuring his right forearm in a fall at his residence. The Vatican confirmed that no bones were broken, but the tumble came weeks after the pontiff bruised his face in another fall in December, Reuters reported. Then, in February 2025, Francis was admitted to the hospital for bronchitis treatment and canceled all scheduled events for the next 3 days. It turned out to be pneumonia. After all, Francis may not have accomplished everything he hoped for, but he was a leader whose charisma and desire to connect with people will long be remembered. He's managed to give many people who had little hope in their church renewed hope. Why do we have a pope? While waiting and preparing for every important moment will happen in the church, let's get some crucial things about the leader of our spirit life. Jesus had countless souls who learned from him, but he only had 12 who he worked with quite intimately. They were sent out on a very specific apostolic mission after being trained by Christ himself. Out of those 12, there were 3 that he selected to be in his closest inner circle of friends: Peter, James, and John. Each of the 3 was given a special role in the church. Peter was the rock on which Jesus would build his church. As every group needs a leader, someone to cast the deciding vote, so did the apostles and the bishops. Simon Peter, the fisherman, rose to the occasion. In his line are popes who become saints and popes who were less than saintly. Yet every pope was given special authority by God to guide the church for a time. As humans, everyone has sins, including Peter himself and even his successors. So, why would Jesus entrust his church to sinners? It's not like Jesus didn't know that people were going to sin. He knows all. He's God. The church, like Jesus Christ, is both human and divine. So while the church is divinely fueled, guided by the Holy Spirit, and perfect in her teachings, it is still composed of humans who are imperfect. Sin exists in the pews just as much as it does in the sacristies, and even when people in leadership sin, that does not render God's laws or God's truths any less valid or truthful. Christ knew Peter was not perfect, yet he still chose him for an all-important task of guiding the church on earth. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The event that Jesus changes Simon's name to Peter is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Because a change in someone's name signals a change in a person's essence. While rock was used to speak about God and even Abraham in the Old Testament, Peter is the only person to be designated the rock by Christ. To be clear, This designation did not mean that Peter became divine, but let's say that it carries with it a divine assistance, an assistance that Jesus promises us. Jesus tells Peter that he is going to build his church. While that is a pretty straightforward statement, some people believe that the first time Jesus says rock, that he is referring to Peter, and the second time he says it, that he's referring to himself. Jesus promises that the netherworld will not prevail against the church. Okay, so what will evil never prevail against? The church. People point to modern problems within the church or a scandal as some sort of proof that Christ was talking about himself as the church, not a church on earth. Not true. Battles may be lost, but never the war. The church will always prevail. Christ promises us that. Jesus gives Peter the keys. The keys not only let people in, they lock people out. The keys signify power. This action, too, is biblical. As seen in Isaiah 22, the Prime Minister of Israel is given the keys, and with that, the power to govern God's people on earth. What Jesus was doing was not only landmark for the future, but also rooted in the past. Think about what it says in Luke 10:16, "Whoever listens to you listens to me. Whoever rejects you rejects me, and whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me." Jesus gives Peter the power to bind and to loose. What does that mean? Sacramental power through confession and reconciliation. Ask yourself, how would Peter, the apostles, or any priest know which sins to bind or to loose if they had not heard the sins first? And Jesus is very clear. They have authority on earth that counts in heaven. Since Peter was martyred, we have been blessed with an unbroken apostolic succession. That is why we have had a successor to the chair of Peter ever since his crucifixion in the mid-1st century. Some claim that the church at times had multiple popes. That is not true. At certain times, there have been more than one person claiming to be the pontiff. However, there has only been one true pope at a time,